Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which I am sad to report is still wrapped in a pandemic, even though our interests and focus are largely elsewhere right now. In America, the vaccine is rolling out pretty swiftly, all things considered. But there's a bunch of countries in the planet with huge populations that have not seen a single dose yet. So don't expect pandemic sanity anytime soon because we're on a global system. We're all connected, as Betsy will explain in her book on Anthropocene choices. And at the meantime, today's focus we're going to kind of take a different timescale approach to looking at where we're at in human experience right now. We're going to go back in time to some epic successes that faded into failures, learn lessons from that, and go forward in time through Betsy's new book and look at what our technology is poised, the choices that it's poised to give us in the weeks and months and years and decades ahead. It's a remarkable time in human history. Stuart Hart, a long time ago, a Cornell professor of management, I heard him give a speech on what he called chronocentrism. He said that every generation feels its age is special. But in that talk, he also said, this really is a special time that we are poised for just such momentous change, and the choices that we make, a lot of the change is up to our own choices. So greetings, Betsy Kolbert and Annalee Newitz, friends from long journeys in journalism, and for Annalee, journeys in science fiction as well. So it's great to have you on Sustain What and talk about your new books. How are you doing? Annalee, you're out in the Bay Area, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's still kind of morning here, and we're actually I think one of the only places in the nation that isn't freezing right now. So
yeah,
pretty grateful for that. Although we'll be on fire again in a few months. So
I know
take what you can.
I'm doing a session on Friday on the Texas freeze, and a lot of the same systemic questions were there in California last year with power supplies and extreme events. Imagine that.
That's right. Yep.
And actually, last Friday, I just did a session from the Himalayas with journalists there and experts on two dams that were destroyed in epic rock slide / glacial explosion / flood. Same thing, energy systems in an environment that's didn't have them until 10 or 15 years ago and full of risk. It's just a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to give a closer look at your book covers for those who are watching. Let's see. And I do want to note that this is not a first-time experience for either of you. You've both been as journalists and explorers of this human moment for a long time. I remember years ago on my .earth blog at the New York Times, I had we talked about Scatter, Adapt, Remember, which was a book on how humans will survive a mass extinction. And of course, Betsy, your book is about how we think we might survive a self-imposed stress of epic proportions through climate change and the like. And your new books are Four Lost Cities, a secret history of the urban age, and Under a White Sky, the nature of the future. I thought we'd start because both of you overlap with Illinois, or what we now know of as Illinois. And you'll see why that's relevant in a second. I do want to start also, given that we're talking about human history and human futures, with an acknowledgement of where I am, and that the landscape that I see as the village of Nelsonville and the town of Phillipstown in the state of New York in the country of the United States has a much deeper history. And I encourage everyone to go to nativeland.ca, a great kind of Google map experience to learn about the history of the terrain under your feet and the peoples, in this case, the Lenape, who are still here and who really shape this landscape in momentous ways. But let's get to Illinois. And I wanted to start with two lines, before we do that, two excerpts from the two books that really kind of crystallize the thinking, I think. Betsy, this was such a great page. I think probably it was high in your book proposal. We face a no analog predicament. If there is to be an answer to the problem of control, it's going to be more control. And as you say, not so much control of nature as the control of nature. In other words, we're already messing things up. Can we further intervene to unmess them? And for you, Annalee, this page really, I think, captures that key point. Modern metropolises are by no means destined to live forever. Historical evidence shows that people have chosen to abandon them repeatedly over the past 8,000 years. It's terrifying to realize that most of humanity lives in places that are destined to die. The myth of the lost city obscures the reality of how people destroy their civilizations. So by doing a deep sort of post-mortem on these cities, we're going to talk about what you've learned. So let's get into this a little bit. And just, I thought it'd be great for each of you to start in Illinois, and you can explain why. And maybe Annalee, we'll start with the past, and then we'll jump to the future. So what led you to Cahokia?
I've been interested in Cahokia for a very, very long time, and I've been writing about it for many years. Cahokia was the largest city in North America about 1,000 years ago. So it's an indigenous city, and the people who lived there are kind of the ancestors of many different tribes and nations today. And when Europeans stumbled across Cahokia, there was a tribe living there called the Cahokia, and so Europeans just named the place Cahokia, but that is not the name of the people who made it. And they were at the core of a civilization called the Mississippian, and this is a loosely linked group of cities and towns all up and down the Mississippi that had shared cultural ideals, shared architectural features in their cities. They all were mound builders. Mound building, of course, in North America goes back about 5,000 years. So there's mound builders, there's waves of mound building civilizations, and this is basically the most recent one. And so if you drive through the South, you'll run into a lot of towns called Mounds and Moundville and things like that. And these are places named after these indigenous cities. So Cahokia was kind of at the center of this civilization. It's right at the nexus of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, right where they split. So it was a great place to be if you wanted transit. And here's a great picture. Thanks for posting that, Andy. This is the downtown area in southern Illinois, one of the major precincts in Cahokia, now a state park. And at the center of it was this giant mound, which is called Monk's Mound by white people. We don't know what it was called originally. And Monk's Mound has basically the same footprint as the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was enormous, made of packed earth, and it rose above this massive plaza below that you can see in this picture. And one of the things that's really interesting about Cahokia, which really kind of gets started around the year 1000 and lasts for several hundred years. So it lasted for much longer than many places in the United States have lasted. And this is a city that went through a number of transformations in its layout. And we think, or archaeologists believe, that these reflected changes in social relationships. And it's a particularly interesting example of seeing how cities are living organisms and how they're constantly changing all the time. They're not static entities. And at one point, the city was on a very rigid grid, and then it morphed into a city that was much more oriented around neighborhoods and courtyards. And eventually people did abandon it. And one idea that I think is worth maybe holding on to during this conversation is the one idea about why people abandoned Cahokia is that perhaps the people who lived there didn't think of cities as places that should last forever. The idea that a city should be immortal is kind of a European notion. It's a Western idea. We think, of course, our cities, if a city, people leave a city, that's terrible. Right. It's a sign of failure. But it seems like, based on a lot of the remains at Cahokia, that the idea of abandonment, the idea of building a city temporarily, was part of the belief system of the people there. And so I think it's a great alternate idea of how we build public structures.
And that gets to, I think there's so much imagination right now, at least among those who are focused on the future of how we shape our cities going forward with sea level rise, and which again is locked in. The rate is still highly uncertain, but the reality that there's no new normal coastline basically for centuries, millennium to come, hasn't really been absorbed. And that idea of permanence versus adaptive plasticity, something you both think about a lot. So Betsy, I wanted to start with the Anthropocene. And there was a conversation I had a couple of years ago, actually 5 or 6 years ago, with Jay Quaid, who is a archaeologist at University of Arizona, and he showed a slide that sort of haunts me still. Let me see if I can pull it up here. That's worth kind of, it's a good transition from this idea of looking at cities to the broader question of the Anthropocene. And we'll get to, hold on, to Chicago. So here he is. He took a thought. He did a thought experiment, and the time scale is almost irrelevant. He basically said 50 million years or something like that, several tens of millions of years into the future, this is what cities will be. Everything we think of as a city now will be so smeared in that geological record that it'll just be sort of a impression of some rare earths that are not uniformly distributed, but that ended up in cities because all the batteries are there, that kind of thing. So here you are, you came out of the sixth extinction and you dove into this new project. What drew you to make the choices you made in building the book and thinking about this grand thing called the Anthropocene and where we go from here?
Well, the sort of bit of reporting that really got me started on this particular trajectory took place several years ago, maybe 4 years ago. I went to Hawaii to report on a project that had already been nicknamed, not by me, the Super Coral Project. And the idea behind that was it was run by a very charismatic scientist named Ruth Gates. And the idea behind the Super Coral Project was, we've thoroughly changed the oceans already. We're heating them up. That's climate change, which affects the oceans very profoundly. And a double whammy is that a lot of the carbon we put in the air, it gets absorbed very quickly by the surface waters of the ocean. So, and changes the chemistry. So we're acidifying the oceans, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, and we're changing the temperature, on geological scale very, very fast. And, one group of organisms that we know already really doesn't like this is reef building corals, which have been really devastated in the last few decades. Something like half of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef have been lost. So the thinking behind this Super Coral Project was, well, we've really, altered the oceans. We're not getting back the oceans of the past in any foreseeable time frame. If we want reefs to survive the 21st century, we're going to have to manipulate the creatures that build reefs, and those are these tiny little gelatinous animals. And that way of thinking, we've intervened on one level, either wittingly or unwittingly, and now we're going to have to intervene again to counteract the effects of our previous interventions. That really got me thinking. And Ruth, who very sadly passed away 2 years ago, was a very compelling person. And what she said, on the one hand, made a lot of sense to me, and on the other hand, I was like, wow. So when I sort of started thinking about it, I started to see that pattern of interventions to deal with interventions everywhere. And that's sort of what became the book.
Yeah, and that coral issue is so interesting. There's other experiments that have gone on looking for, as you know, that's in the book too, the can we intervene, not just with genetics or nurseries, but I think it was Ken Caldera who's seeing if there's a way to sort of change the pH locally in reef water to see if you can kind of make the reefs last longer. I guess that gets to this question of a lot of how we think about the future is predicated on these things we place, maybe it's aesthetic value in, like reefs, coral reefs have this, we have a vision of them now, but as you know, in deep history, corals have been around forever, right? It's the reefs that we know, the features of the landscape that are what are in, quote unquote endangered. How does that play into how people are examining that question? The people you interviewed, different.
You mean the idea that reefs have changed over time? I mean, certainly, when sea levels were very different, 15,000 years ago, the reefs were very different. just because of where the coast was and where the sea level was. But, you know, the reef building corals that we have now as a group of organisms, they've been around for a long time. They are very old organisms, and coral reefs are ancient, as you know, ancient. They've been built by different creatures over different periods. You know, different whole different orders, I guess, of corals have come and gone. But the reef, you know, the family of corals that are now dominant, you know, they're very old. They're you know, they've been around for the whole, you know, certainly since the Cretaceous extinction. So, you know, if you think of a creature that, you know, actually has outlasted all sorts of environmental change, you know, it would be reef building corals. And I think one of the very daunting facts is, you know, there are these things in the geological record called reef gaps, where there were truly no reef building organisms around, or they were unable to build reefs. Let's put it that way. And those are, you know, those are some of the worst disasters in the history of life. You know, so if you think, oh, there's going to be a reef gap, you know, if you go back to your markers of the Anthropocene, you know, if you leave the city, you leave an urban area, and you go out into the middle of the ocean and just, you know, dig a core, which is presumably what the geologists of the future will do. If they see a reef gap, they'll be, wow, something really bad happened then.
Yeah, actually, you know, I hadn't thought about this until just now, but there's an intersection here, perhaps, in that if we could figure out a way to be more like corals. Of course, they have two life stages, so they're free floating, and they adjust over time. The reefs move, as you said. It's kind of like what we were talking about just a minute ago with cities. So, is that, Annalee, as you think about also maybe using your science fiction skills, is there a model for humanity that more has that float quality to it?
A float. I was like, do you want us to become sessile organisms? Because that might solve some stuff, but create a whole new set of problems. You know, I actually, with sort of a science fictional bent, I have thought a little bit about this question. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, and this is going to be our wacky moment in the show, I think, is that, you know, I feel like part of the problem that humans have is that we are so hyper individualized, but we keep coming together in these large scale social networks and structures, whether they're physical structures or they're structures online or whatever. And, you know, I think we need to be more like colony organisms, like ants or termites or naked mole rats, who are also a colony organism and a mammal. So it can be done, because you don't see ants in a colony who are starving or who are, you know, without a home. And I actually spent quite a bit of time bothering scientists who study colony organisms about this and asking them, like, well, why can't humans be more like this? And of course, the answers are obvious, right? This is not how we are set up genetically. We're focused culturally on individualism, but also we're not all clones of, you know, we're not all sisters and brothers, which is the case in almost all of these colony species. Alternate path really, not in a science fictional mode, but in a political mode where we really lean into the idea of taking care of each other and of taking care of the environment and acknowledging that human societies and civilizations depend on non-human life forms. And so, you know, that is a big strand in this kind of futurist thinking. I also think that, as I said, it's kind of bonkers. I don't think we're going to get there. But it's certainly, it's an interesting thought experiment to wonder what it would be like if we were just more conscious of how interdependent we are on each other as humans and on the environment and on the farms and the wildlife that sustain us as a species.
We should get back to that point, but for sure, because you explore that in your book, Annalee, the having cities that are more integrated with ecosystems. There's such interesting work underway to try to figure out that. But now let's go back to the weirdness factor, which is the invasives and undoing the unnatural in quest of something we might call post-human Renatural. Is there a renaturalization? Well, let's get back to Illinois. I'm going to show something here that will amuse you. And I just found this. I didn't realize there was a water sport now of netting carp while you're water skiing.
Oh boy.
So let's get back to Illinois, Betsy. And you make choices always. There's lionfish and sashimi, and there's so many other invasive species stories. What attracted you to Chicago's particular story? Why was that featured?
Well, that was just such a vivid example of this phenomenon, that I alluded to, of intervening on top of an intervention. So the story here, and I don't know where exactly these folks are.
It says Peoria.
Peoria. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're quite a bit south of where my story takes us, but very relevant. And that is that the story begins long after the Mississippian culture was either died off or was done in. I'm not enough of an expert to know. Annalee would know.
It transformed into other cultures. So yeah.
Okay. So when the colonists, I call them, although we were sort of post. I don't. The U.S. was already a country anyway. Basically settled along the Chicago River, basically in the 19th century, early 19th century, I guess. They found a Chicago River that it was a good place for a city. There was a river running through it. It ran to the east. It ran into Lake Michigan. Chicago grew up along this river that was very handy for dumping all of your waste into. And Chicago did dump all of its waste into the river. And as the stockyards grew, this became, a tremendous amount of waste, as you can imagine. And it was said that the river was so thick with filth that a chicken could walk across it without getting her feet wet. And all of this was flowing into Lake Michigan, which was and still is Chicago's sole source of drinking water. So, you can do the math here. There was a lot of waterborne disease. And eventually, at the turn of the 20th century, it was decided that something had to be done about that. So the decision was made to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. It was a huge construction project, which was accomplished. The construction of what is now called the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal accomplished the reversal of the river. It was a great triumph. And there was a headline, a sort of facetious headline in the New York Times when it finally opened that said something like, water in the Chicago River resembles liquid again, or something like that, when this thing finally opened. So it solved a big problem, big public health problem. But what the canal did was it linked the Great Lakes drainage system and the Mississippi drainage system, which had previously been separated. They're not very dramatically separated. There's no Rockies in between them, but there was enough land that it was very tough if you were an aquatic creature to, get from one to the other. But now it was open season. Anything could cross through this canal, and that was not that much of a problem before modern sewage treatment. There was still so much waste from Chicago in this canal that it was basically a dead zone. But as the Clean Water Act came in, and as the water got cleaned up, one of the sort of paradoxical results was you had this ecological problem that you could now mix the species from the two basins. And both of these basins, what's important to point out is they're highly invaded, especially the Great Lakes, highly invaded system. Right. And so you had invasive species on both sides wreaking havoc, and people in both basins didn't want the creatures from the other basin. And so at the turn of the 20th century, it was decided, okay, something's got to be done about that. And what was done, and it was not actually immediately in response to the Asian carp, which is what Andy was showing. Those are Asian carp jumping out of the river. Very, very successful. Not one invasive species, but actually several invasive.
Well, I love in the book how you describe them. They each have sort of a superpower.
Yes, and the ones species that you were showing, the jumping ones, are silver carp, which are very, very, very voracious filter feeders, and have really, really altered all of the waterways that they are in, which are, you know, multitudinous now. All of, you know, the little tributaries of the Mississippi. Some places they make up something like, you know, over 75% of the biomass these days. So anyway, so just to complete this story, the Army Corps of Engineers has literally electrified a portion of the canal. I took a trip there. It was actually a lot of fun. You get to these electric barriers. There are huge signs. You know, do not keep your kids with you. Do not let anyone in the water, because you could, you know, genuinely get electrocuted. And the idea is these pulsing electricity into the water, we will discourage creatures from making that crossing. And the creature that right now is the sort of, as it was said to me by one Army Corps engineer, public enemy number one is really the silver carp, which they really do not want to get into the Great Lakes. And for, you know, in good part because of the sort of antics of the carp that you showed in that video.
Yeah, they're actually a health hazard, like getting hit with one.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I spoke to a lot of people who had to have, you know, eye surgery. I mean, when one of those hits you, I did get hit by a carp in the leg. It was painful and nothing. It had no real consequences. But the guys who are out there all the time fishing on, you know, the Illinois River, for example, that picture was doubtless from the Illinois River. Yeah. You get hit all the time, and it can be life-threatening.
So while I was sifting for some relevant imagery, I realized this is a Natural Resources Defense Council blog post on redesigning the Chicago River. This is a bit of a diversion, but it's highly relevant to Annalee's thinking. Let me just show you here. I just saw this. So they're doing kind of a planning exercise like New York City has been doing for sea level rise. But here, this is an NRDC project envisioning a Chicago of the future that sort of has some of those qualities, adaptive, shape-shifty qualities that Annalee was talking about. I don't know, Betsy, that wasn't really a focus of your carp work, your canal work, but maybe if you could both weigh in briefly on this idea of what cities have to let go of in this new environment. Maybe Annalee and then Betsy on that.
Sure. Well, in my book, Four Lost Cities, one of the cities that I talk about a lot is Angkor, which is today in Cambodia. It was at the heart of the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia about 1,000 years ago. And they have a very unique environment there where they're kind of at the nexus of two monsoon systems. So the weather is quite extreme. They were dealing with climate extremes a millennium ago that we're kind of facing now on the coasts in the States and, of course, throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so it's interesting to see what their engineers did at the time to deal with the fact that they would be flooding and in drought almost every year. And so they created an incredible water infrastructure, kind of like that picture that you were showing, where the idea was to bring water into the city through natural mountain streams that were created by these weather systems, and have massive reservoirs that were both ceremonial but had a very practical purpose. And they built massive canal systems. And so the idea was store water. You know, when it's the wet season, bring the water into the city, contain it. And then when we're in dry season, we've got all this water stored up that we can use for agriculture. And they did, in fact, have very intensive agriculture within the city. It was what we would now call a garden city, but at the time was just a practical city. You have farms in the middle of your city. And here's what happened. They had some rough times. They had about 100 years where they were vacillating between extreme drought and extreme flooding. Mm-hmm. And we can all relate to this today in North America. And the main problem was that the leadership in the city, the government, which was the kings of both the Khmer Empire, but also the city of Angkor itself, which had about 1 million people in it, they just didn't want to intervene anymore. At a certain point, they stopped paying for upkeep of this water system. And so a lot of the canals filled with silt, which blocked them. And then they would build new canals. And then when there was a massive flood, there were so many canals that more water came into the city than even would have come in naturally. And so over time, what we see is a gradual abandonment of the city, not because they didn't have a way to deal with these environmental problems, because they did, but because they lost the political will to maintain the structures that they built to deal with these problems. So yes, they had a period of intensified drought and flooding, but this wasn't something that, like I said, that was outside their expertise. You know, these were very simple solutions that they had that involved compensating laborers and involved paying attention to urban infrastructure. And so when I look at city transformations today, I think about that. I think and I think Betsy's done a great job talking about this in her work, where we kind of reach for this scientific solutionism, like we're going to invent flubber and flubber will save us from all this stuff. And it's like, actually, we already have a solution.
Right.
We need a political system that will maintain it.
Yeah, that issue of maintenance. I think Stuart Brand is writing a book now on maintenance, on the boring stuff. And actually, Will Happer, I'm getting a bit of feedback. I'm not sure why that happened. Who was this notorious climate skeptic who was briefly an advisor for Trump. I interviewed him early on when Trump was choosing to pick science advisors. He was high on the list. And he went into this whole interesting point about he likes the Hindu mythology because they have a creator, a destroyer, and a maintainer. He said, we always forget about the maintainer. I mean, along with his ridiculous ideas on CO2, he had some really informed ideas on other aspects of science and history. And that does seem to be, Betsy, I know, it's the boring stuff, you know, that sometimes we forget. How does that feel for you?
Well, I mean, I think one of the, profound issues that we face is that, urban infrastructure is sort of, built, and there's Annalee has a lot of, incredibly fascinating stuff in her book. I really learned a lot from it. But, modern contemporary urban infrastructure is built for stasis, right? It's built for climate stasis. It's built for this period that we
Right.
lucked into, let's say, where sea levels were relatively constant. You could exist on a spit of deltaic land. That was, as it were, an error in judgment that, people have understood for quite a long time. Deltas are, by their very nature, changeable. You can plant your flag there, as it were. But, if you're going to insist that the delta not change, eventually you're going to come up against some pretty serious problems. So, one of the cities that I talk about, and my book does not take place in very many urban areas, but the only city that it really, well, I guess it takes place partly in Chicago and then partly in New Orleans, which is a city, not literally built on sand, but literally built on silt. And, we very successfully, humanity, Americans, first the French, the French got there in 1718, and they immediately came with this colonial mindset of, we're no longer going to let this river, push us around. We're going to push the river around. They started pushing the river around, pretty successfully. I mean, New Orleans is a 300-year-old city, which in the U.S. is a pretty, that's an old city, not by global standards, obviously. But the waterworks, the huge levees, the up and down the Mississippi, the colossal, anyone who has looked at the water management system in New Orleans, which is, maybe second only to the water management system in the Netherlands, it's an amazing, colossal, pharaonic set of structures. And it's had the effect of mostly keeping New Orleans dry. There have been some very notable exceptions, obviously, but it's also had the effect of starving the area, the whole region of the sediment that built it,
Right.
that created it. And that cannot go on. That's just an unsustainable situation. So New Orleans is one of the fastest sinking places on earth. And that's true, of a lot of places. And, we just saw last year, I guess it was, this announcement, we're going to move the whole city of Jakarta. We're just going to move it move the capital to another island because this city is sinking so fast for somewhat different reasons, but somewhat similar reasons. And so, this idea that you can, and millions and millions and millions of people are living in places that are vulnerable, very vulnerable. We know, as you said, Andy, we know we're getting sea level rise. The only question at this point is, how much and how fast. But, New York City, that's a very, very good example. How are you going to protect Lower Manhattan? It's very, very vulnerable. And so you're going to have to either become a lot more flexible, how's that? Or yes, you can see New Orleans there on this disappearing, strip of land. That was an old delta lobe built by the Mississippi, built by that river that's now in a complete straitjacket, never allowed, when it overflows its banks, it's considered a catastrophe, which it is to the city. But for the land, it's a blessing.
There's been some interesting writing. There's a young journalist who did a piece out of Bangladesh a couple of years ago in the journal Science in the news section on them getting comfortable with letting the sediment in, like basically making flooding a normal part of how they adapt those landscapes. And 10 years ago on .earth, my Times blog, I wrote about engineers in Bangladesh who were getting tired of their country being as this sort of poster child for inevitable refugees. And they were doing studies of the sedimentation, and they found there were plenty of ways that Bangladesh can persist by harvesting all that stuff coming down from the Himalayas. And I guess that gets to that point of reimagining our narratives too sometimes, meaning us as journalists, or, who do we label a refugee, or what places do we say are doomed? When we say an island is doomed, are we making a mistake as opposed to looking at the solution stories, which might be there too?
Yeah, I think those are all very good points. But I think that, fundamentally, we're in this very difficult situation where, we're instruments of instability, and our societies have grown up counting on stability and negotiating that, I covered politics. I covered Albany politics for a long time. And, when you think of the fights that we're going to have over, every piece of land, the timescales are just the legal structures. We're just, we no longer live in a world where you can, where you can pick up and move. Someone owns that piece of land that you might want to move to. Right. So we're in a, you could call it, scary. You could call it fascinating. I mean, you choose your adjective, but it's some very, very, very large forces coming into conflict.
Totally. I was wondering, Annalee, in looking at these cities in the past, and I wanted to there were some points, I would love you to describe the points you found most violate our preconceptions about cities past, like Pompeii was a slow motion thing. I think I always thought of it just in the context of the dramatic eruption and blah, blah, blah. But what are some of the other elements that have been misportrayed by us colonialist, traditionalist authors and writers? What are the big aha?
I guess I would say two things, and this kind of goes back to what we've been talking about around this kind of idea that cities should last forever, and that we're kind of obsessed with maintaining things in a certain way. We've only really been living in cities for 9,000 years, and that's by some reckonings. I mean, other people have a much more narrow definition of cities, and they would say it's even less time. But some of the first cities, one of the cities I look at, which is Neolithic, it's a 9,000-year-old city called Çatalhöyük. It's in central Turkey. And this was a city that is on the cusp between the period when Homo sapiens was largely a nomadic species, with seasonal camping, of course, like you might camp out for a few weeks somewhere and then move on. So it's on the cusp between that kind of a life and settlement life. So only 9,000 years ago. And you have to imagine that that would have been a huge cultural shock for people to go from a culture that was based around mobility and change and transformation to staying in one place and only eating the food you grow in that one place, with a few exceptions. And it created a lot of interesting structures and art in the city. And one of the things that people do in that city is they bury their dead under their beds. And to me, that was shocking because it violates all kinds of taboos that we have. Now we think of that. I mean, there's just name a taboo and it kind of violates it. But I think that it was part of this kind of extreme activity of keeping your dead under the bed, was about how hard it was for people to change their mentality to a mentality of settlement. And that in order to feel connected to a place, you kind of had to put your ancestors physically in the ground there so that you could transition from a world where your identity came from your family, came from your tribe or your nation. And then suddenly your identity comes from a place, like, you're from New York or you're from Çatalhöyük. And so it was a very difficult transition, and not all humans made that transition. I mean, we still have nomadic people. And during the time that Çatalhöyük was a going concern and having big parties, most of humanity was still mobile. And I think that, to me, that story, it kind of haunts our settlements and our cities and our farms even now, that there's a part of our species that really wants to roam, wants to do what Betsy was saying, like just pick up and go somewhere else, like, oh, we screwed up over here. Why can't we just go to the next reef? And it's like, well, unfortunately, that can't happen anymore. And now we're having to, I think we're entering a new phase that may take 1,000 years, where we're having to reinvent mobility and transformation and build that into our expectations about the environment. And so instead of saying we're going to stick New Orleans here and we're going to keep it there, it's like, well, we have a city in this area. It moves around, and it moves around to reflect what's happening with the rivers or what's happening with the tides. And I don't mean it moves around like every 5 minutes, but the idea that you would have architecture that could sustain something like that. What does that look like? There's a lot of different ideas about what that looks like, but I think that's where we have no choice. That's where we have to go.
Actually, I hadn't thought about this, but this is highly relevant. In June, Columbia is hosting a managed retreat conference, which is about the places where, because of global warming and sea level rise, habitability really goes away. The adaptation only takes you so far. And this gets to Betsy's points about politics. We had a meeting, the first meeting like this was last summer. A year and a half. That whole
yeah, the pandemic year.
It was the summer before the pandemic, BC, and before COVID. The most interesting sessions there were by groups who are trying to figure out how you create not just a politics, but a social dynamic that can do the things that need to be done to invent a new way of living, where your old zoning patterns, your old construction patterns, and your old norms are fundamentally challenged. The only places it seems to work are where you have sort of people who are professional conversation builders. The Consensus Institute here along the Hudson River and other places. And so, Betsy, it seems like there's a whole new politics that has to come with this. What does that feel like?
Well, I think, I really don't want to claim any expertise on, how our politics need to evolve. But, I think one thing that, I would argue is that we need to acknowledge that some of our desires are just fundamentally in conflict. We're not going to be able to, a lot of our infrastructure, the way we have tended to build infrastructure, once again, depends on permanence. So if you say, okay, that's not possible anymore, and I think that's a very reasonable response, you're going to have to rethink everything from the ground up. How are you going to get energy? How are you going to deal with your sewage? You know, we are just we're in a very difficult situation because improvising with 8 billion people on the planet and massive amounts of capital sunk into the infrastructure that we have, and you know, every bit or most bits of land certainly in the developed world claimed by someone. You know, you put all those factors together and you say, you know, wow, any one of those would be a challenge, but add them all together, that's just a layered challenge that, you know, there's not a lot of room for experimentation is, I guess, what profoundly worries me. You know, yeah, it would be great to say, oh, well, let's just take, you know, even a part of New York City and we'll run this experiment, you know, but you go to that city council meeting, you know, so it's really, really tough to imagine it. I think Annalee's right. You know, it's probably a very, very long process, and anyone who tells you, you know, how we're going to get through this or how many of us are going to get through it, you know, is blowing smoke. You know, no one knows.
But I do think it's interesting to talk about it as a matter of property. Like I like that you said, you know, well, but there's all this land, but it's owned by people. And, you know, like we see this a lot in African nations where there's foreign countries that just own massive amounts of farmland there. Right. And so the people who actually live there don't own their own food. You know, they're growing food that they don't own, which it's really scary that sounds normal to us. And I think that's one of the reasons I take a lot of inspiration from things like the land back movement, which is really heated up over the last couple of years, which is just a movement to give land back to indigenous groups or just indigenous individuals. I think this is also why we're seeing a lot of kind of people getting excited again about kind of old-fashioned socialist politics, this idea of like, well, we need to reallocate property first. And then once we can do that, which again is a long process and lots of bad council meetings, you know, that's sort of where we have to start is reimagining what it means to own land.
So this brings up I don't know if you can go a little bit longer, but if you can't, just let me know. But I do we got to get into geoengineering. In other words, who owns the sky and what do we do with it? You know, the interesting thing that I've been thinking about a lot in recent years, after 33 years of covering climate change, is that essentially, you know, it's been this unwitting process mostly. Even now, it's being absorbed societally. And obviously fossil fuel companies tried to obscure the evidence, but it's not like we just said, oh, this is stupid, we're going to stop it and change. And now we're getting to this point of managing the climate. Like, okay, we know we're doing something stupid. Besides stopping doing that, we know we have to do something else. This is a big chunk of Betsy's book, and the title too. So there's some questions I have about it, but just what's your sense? I've heard you in some other interviews, and in the book, you kind of, I think you, like me, you have the sense of not taking a side particularly, and not just in an objective, not just in a journalistic attempt to be, you know, neutral, but really because it's hard to know how this is going to play out. I don't know when you think about these interventions, and there are two kinds. Let's just focus on solar engineering because getting carbon out of the air is so much less contentious. So when you think of this prospect, which could come to the pass this year if precautionary principle environmentalists don't stop this tiny experiment, what comes to mind for you? Or is this audacious? Is it inevitable? How do you characterize it?
Well, I think that, you know, I assembled a sort of string of quotes, which, you know, ran from Tim Flannery, you know, this is a broad highway to hell, to another characterization, this is inevitable. And, you know, it's possible for both of them to be right.
Right. Like so many things we've been doing, right?
Exactly. So, you know, I think that the thing that's important to understand about geoengineering, and it very often gets, posed as sort of these mad, some mad scientist or some rogue billionaire is going to do it, by him or herself. I think the thing that's really important to understand and what sort of motivates discussion even of solar geoengineering is the fact, I think you would have to call it a fact, that you cannot do anything about climate change very quickly. I think that's not really appreciated. I mean, even in all of our conversations, I don't know, it'd be interesting to do a focus group with pretty knowledgeable people and say, okay, let's say at the point that you get to net zero, which we're obviously, quite a ways from, but there's at least talk of that now. The point that you get to net zero, you have not solved the problem of climate change. You have just stopped making climate change worse. Okay, and so there's still warming in the pipeline. It's debated how much, we can talk about that, but there's still warming in the pipeline, and there's certainly all of the, long feedbacks that people like Jim Hansen are talking about, right? So you're still melting the polar ice caps, presumably that. So you're not getting that back. And if you decide at a certain point, and every day you can open some journal or the New York Times and find a story, this is happening, it's happening faster than the models predicted. So it's not a comforting situation. And if you got to a situation where you decided this is just a humanitarian disaster or an ecological disaster, what are you going to do? There's only one tool that people have come up with in the toolbox, and that is to counter, a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere with some kind of reflective matter in the stratosphere. That's the only idea that's out there for reversing climate change quickly. There's all sorts of talks about reversing climate change by lowering emissions. That ain't reversing climate change. So these are just unfortunate and very sobering facts. And once you get there, then you really do have to ask yourself the question. And I think it's a profound and open question, but I understand why there are very, very smart people. I spent a bunch of time with the guys at the Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program, and they are very, very smart people. And they are not, mad scientists. And they would say, we have to at least know whether we even have this tool. Do we even have it if we needed it? And that's the argument for doing this experiment this summer, as you said. It's not even an experiment. It's just putting up a balloon to see if you could do an experiment. But, but there's also a lot of pushback. And I understand that too, because, anything that suggests that you could take your foot off the pedal for the most rapid decarbonization possible is potentially politically very dangerous. So I do understand that. I understand both arguments.
Annalee, you're dug in on this stuff too with a lot. So when you think about geoengineering, and maybe on the time scale, looking with these timescales of history, what's your sense of that option?
Well, if you want to get super deep time nerdy, one of the things that archaeologists talk about a lot, and paleontologists too, is a term, anthropogenic geomorphology. And this is something that is just humans altering, the earth for our purposes. And people have been doing this for about 45,000 years. We've been draining swamps. We've been redirecting rivers. We've been doing controlled burning, opportunistically sort of tossing seeds out and kind of hoping that trees that we like will grow. Long before we had sort of formalized agriculture. So this is something that we do. Humans are like beavers, we just, part of our species is like, we just love to chew up trees and stick them in places they don't belong, and to remold our planet. And now, of course, we're talking about doing it at a scale where we're altering the carbon cycle, right? Or we're altering the sun, which I think is so funny. There's so many geoengineering projects where I look at them and I'm like, if this were a science fiction story, I would criticize it because it's based on something that doesn't make any sense, or it requires what we call in science fiction hand-wavium, which is like that you've invented something and you just kind of, faster than light travel. We power it with hand-wavium. So there's a lot of hand-wavium going on, I think, in these thought experiments. And there's a lot of danger because some of the ones that we could do now, like tossing particulates into the atmosphere or doing iron seeding in the oceans, those can become weapons. Jaime Cascio, who's been writing about this kind of stuff for a really long time, geoengineering, has always said, look, one person's geoengineering project is another person's super weapon. And so, that's the kind of dystopian vision, is that these things will end up being weapons rather than a way to actually intervene in the carbon cycle in a meanthology way. Or they will be intervening, but it'll be in this disastrous way.
By the way, I'm not sure if this is Cascio commenting here. So Zoology and geoengineering will be an act of desperation. Although as I'm with, it could be, who knows? If it is, hey, he should come on the show sometime. Can you go a little bit longer? Or are you guys rushing to another interview or something?
I can go a couple minutes.
Yeah, same.
Great, because this is too much fun. And, a lot of this isn't fun, but we have to change. I think it's taken me a long time to move from the sort of warning, Bill Robinson, this 1988 story to a different way of framing this question in my own head. And I think, there has to be a generation of young designers and urban planners and architects and landscape architects who just get really excited about the moment. Say, how do you, taking back to that NRDC image of Chicago, if it's all woe is me rhetoric, then it sort of disempowers anyone who's trying to build a world forward. And this is why I reject Biden's build back better. I think we need to build forward better in new ways, or at least to enable the capacity for creative engagement with what's inevitable. As Betsy said, inertia is a bitch. It's in the system, and still work on decarbonization. Has to be there aggressively too, for the same reason. You can't. Then you're endlessly destabilizing, endlessly developing a landscape of bizarre situations and these unintended consequences, which riddle your book, Betsy. So I guess that question, and I think you both have it in your books, that sort of provocation for the wider audience, is finding a way to get comfortable with change. Is that like, if there's one message that resonates between the two, does that feel like the one?
I'll let Annalee take that.
Yeah, get comfortable with change can mean a lot of things. I think we have to get comfortable with the idea that we need to change and that we need to adapt better to the natural environment. I also think that increasingly the idea of creating a rigid line between what's natural and not natural doesn't make any sense. And that we need to kind of let go of that and just be thinking about how do we sustain environments that are healthy for whole ecosystems, all of the creatures in that ecosystem, not just like humans and dogs and cats or something like that, or human dogs and cats and ants, the cornerstone species of the urban environment. But getting comfortable, there's the other side of it where it's like, I feel the conservative argument, which is get comfortable with climate change. It's just inevitable. Screw it. Who cares? There's nothing we can do. That really worries me. That's where I feel like, a lot of stasis comes in, a lot of political kind of nihilism. And I think we can do something. I think it is true that it's going to take a while, and cutting emissions is just step 0.5 in a 10-point plan. But we have to get used to changing our expectations about the environment. And we also have to get used to the idea that we have to push back. And we can't just sit back and wait for politics as we know them to move in their slow way towards something better, because we may need to be taking more direct actions. So, yeah.
I remember Dan Schrag, who's in Betsy's book for sure, at Harvard, like a decade or more ago. He gave a talk at the UN. And I remember him saying he was recognizing the impossibility of political change at this moment. That was 10 years ago. And he was saying what science can do in the meantime is create a bigger menu of options. And I think that drives some of the folks working in geoengineering, but even more so working on CRISPR in context of agriculture, getting past livestock as a way to have meat-like protein. Bill Gates is launching his new book and talks a lot about that. So and I think people forget sometimes that technology can, again, lower the barriers to political change. Sometimes it can raise them if it's done in the wrong way, as has happened with several geoengineering efforts. The guy who went off the British Columbia coast and dumped iron into the ocean screwed up the whole thing for a lot of people. So that seems to be, I think both of you have done a really good job of laying out, not just in your books now, but in your reporting and everything, laying out that a comfort factor with some of this is important. I wanted to ask you each if there's some last thing we haven't talked about in each book that you're craving the public should know about, or that would attract readers. Let's cap things with that, or even a short reading if there's any passage or idea that we haven't talked about yet. Maybe Betsy.
Well, the only point that I want to make is, this has been a heavy conversation, and both of our books are pretty heavy in their own way, but I just read Annalee's book, and there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in there, so you'll learn a lot. And I will say, for my own efforts, that it's sort of, we're in a semi-absurd situation, and I think there's a lot of dark comedy here, for better or worse, that I tried to capture some of that.
You're good. Your sense of humor comes through.
No,
thank you.
That's one of the things that I loved about this book, was I kept seeing the kind of dark comedy satire in there. It was awesome.
Thank you. So, I think there are a lot of, I guess I'd say there's a lot of different, none of us has answers, but there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of different ways to think about what's going on. And it's simply a fascinating moment to be alive, may you live in interesting times,
Absolutely.
So, whatever consolation there is in that.
I think that's a good way to look at it. And we have to keep telling ourselves stories. I think widening the range of narratives is really important. And so Annalee, and we haven't even talked about your science fiction. We'd have to get to a whole nother show.
That's a whole, yeah. I would say that just jumping off what you were saying, one of the kind of story that always attracts me as a journalist and as a fiction writer are stories about survival. And I think that as we think about narratives moving into the future around the environment and around politics of the environment, that focusing on those stories is really important, and learning about how previous cultures have survived, but also how just individual humans have survived in times of tumult and darkness. Humanity has been through some really horrific times in the past, and so has the planet before we were here. And I think listening to those kinds of stories helps give us not just kind of the practical tools to kind of build a new world, but also the psychological tools we need to keep going. Because I think part of this fight, because it's such a long term, and I don't even want to use the term fight, it's a struggle with forces that are human and not human. And part of what we need is just, how do we maintain our own energy? How do you maintain your energy to fix something that will not be fixed in your lifetime? You're never going to live to see a world where none of us will live to see a world where we're not menaced by all these climate change storms and sea level rise and pandemics. So I think we need to focus on these stories of survival. And the thing about my book, Four Lost Cities, is that it's about how these cities actually didn't get lost, and that was kind of a myth, and that these civilizations continued. They changed, they morphed, but they still affect us today, and we still learn from them, and they're still part of our cultures. Some survival, strong, good survivance in there with the dark comedy, just to get through, I think is really important.
Yeah. And a lot of that's about community. The whole, what storytelling is a way to reach out and connect with people. And one thing at the Earth Institute here, I'm trying to do is to build, to focus as much on building better conversations as telling better stories. So it's the back and forth part, the sharing stories, the asking questions, creating envisioning exercises. What should Chicago look like 100 years from now? I really love the Manna-Hata project that Eric Sanderson and others did, showing 400 years ago what Manhattan was for the Lenape, and then, but that book did not do was it didn't go 400 years into the future. I show a slide where I have a big question mark there. So that is a key part of what both of your books and your work drive toward, is engaging people in that quiet conversation. Great to have Annalee Newitz and Betsy Kolbert on Sustain What. This is the Earth Institute experiment. It's my initiative in communication and sustainability, and do these sessions several times a week. This Friday, we're doing one on the Texas deep freeze and the wider questions about balancing being cheap with being resilient, which Texas utterly failed on. And on Sundays, the shows are focused on the arts. We'll have another Sunday one on music. Thanks again, both of you, for being here. And I hadn't thought about this until a couple of minutes ago, but I'm going to end with a little, with Liberated Carbon, the song that I wrote about humanity's experiment with carbon. And it kind of gets at where we go from here. So just if you can tune, it's just a 3-minute tune. So just watch while we close things out. It might be fun. So here is Liberated Carbon.
It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. BP's black label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. Yeah, they say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Hunt those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We send an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, babe. It's the American way.
So there you go. Now we have to liberate some small particles. Thank you both for being here today. And whoops. And have a good afternoon or good
All right.
evening.
Yeah,
Or good
thanks so
morning.
much for having
Thanks,
me.
Andy. Thanks,
Yeah.
Annalee.
And come back
Yeah,
sometime.
Thanks,
This,
Betsy. All right.
this is a long journey.
It is.
1,000 years. Soon,
At least.
It is. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Onward. Well, you're doing your part. All right. Take care again.
All right. Bye now.
Ciao, ciao.